Okay, well, hello everybody and welcome to the Fashion Minority Alliance Festival. We are really excited to have you with us and being part of this panel discussion entitled How to Be an Ally with Everyday Racism and special guests Dawn Mason and Erica Banks. It's a real pleasure to have you guys with us to be in discussion on this topic. So it would be really great if we could just maybe go around, say hi, introduce ourselves, and a little bit about what we do.
Okay, cool. Goes first.
Dawn, do you want to go first?
I talk far too much. I should tell you that right now. My name is Dawn Mason. I'm the CEO and founder of Dawn Mason Inc. I represent, basically it's a PR agency that represents some amazing talent, actors, actresses, models, musicians, across the board. Very proud of a division that we recently launched around 2 years ago, which is called Seat at the Table. And that is something that we set up to ensure that everyone, as we all should, has a voice, and that's everyone. So that's me.
Fantastic, thank you. Erica.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me. My name is Erica Shimizu Banks. I'm calling in from Washington, D.C. and it's so nice to be in conversation with folks in the UK as I went to grad school there. And I miss it very much, especially because of the pandemic limiting travel. So hello from DC. I'm the founder of SheSo, an intersectional equity consulting firm. We work with clients who are really looking to truly hold themselves accountable and hold corporations accountable to racial, gender, equity, and all sorts of equities across identities. And looking at intersectionality, not just from the identity perspective, but also from the perspective of taking a comprehensive, holistic, systemic look at discrimination and how we must fight it in nonprofit, in government, and in corporations. So excited to be with you all today.
Oh, thanks, Erica.
Thank you for that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's so great. And we are Naomi and Natalie. This is Naomi, I'm Natalie. And we are the founders of Everyday Racism, which is a anti-racism organization. And we run a big Instagram platform. So we put out resources, people in, thank you, for people in order to become anti-racist, but also to help people be an ally and to try and educate people more when it comes to racism, specifically as well in the UK. So yeah, that is us, and we're going to be hosting tonight. So we've got a lot to get through.
Yeah.
So we're going to get straight into it. So obviously the session is about allyship. But first of all, I'd love to know from you both, what is an ally? How would you sum an ally?
For me, an ally is somebody who is genuine for a start, not performative, someone who basically is human and sees what is right, almost doesn't need to be told when something injustice is happening or something is wrong, and is prepared to support you in any way that they can, or that minoritized group in any way that they can, and not expecting anything back. That is an ally for me personally.
I love that interpretation, Dawn. I think it's important to note when we have this conversation that so often allyship is asked of people of color to tell white people how they can be better. And I like to keep the focus there, absolutely. But I also find, especially with white audiences, they want to know, well, we're not the only ones that should be allies, right? So I will say, you know, I work with a definition taken from the Anti-Oppression Network and the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I've combined their definitions to create this working definition that I use with a lot of groups, which is that an ally is someone who seeks solidarity with an oppressed or marginalized group of people out of a sense of responsibility and genuine interest in overturning oppressive power structures. So very much in line with what Dawn outlined. But one thing I do add is that depending on the context, everyone holds systemic power in some areas and lacks it in others. And so everyone has areas in which they can practice allyship. It's not a status, it's not an identity, and it's definitely not an award. It's a responsibility we have towards other humans.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like a word that really has been thrown around quite a lot, you know, particularly over the last sort of 18 months.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. So on. I would agree.
And you just kind of hear it thrown about without really the kind of substance and the thought behind what does it really mean. And obviously, when you said, Erica, it depends on context as well, because, you know, we're talking about anti-racism, but of course, there are other situations where Black and brown people and people of color might have, you know, power in a different situation and can be allies to other communities. So
we always are. That is almost as always a given. So why is that not, reciprocated? Or why do we have to beg for that to be reciprocated? I'm personally bored of that, all of it. And
Absolutely.
Yes, it's appreciated, but how can we have been, brought up in a way by our families that encourages decency, encourages us, despite the various oppression that we've had, to still love everyone? Why are we different? And then I don't know if I'm articulating myself very well, but it doesn't make any sense to me.
I hear you, Dawn. And I think, I see that in a couple ways. Like, one, I think even with this definition I gave and talking about everyone having relative power, when we think about it, still white people hold the majority of that power in every realm. So no matter what, like, white people should be exercising allyship in every space. But when I think about reflecting on that for our community, I think about, for example, my individual position, which is as a mixed race woman who is light-skinned, who went to Oxford for grad school. And so within my community, I have a responsibility for, folks who aren't mixed race, folks who are not perceived as distanced from Blackness, folks who are not perceived as having class or education privilege, to be an ally within my community for those groups. And, colorism is a very real problem within our community, but at its root is white supremacy. And so I think it's important when we think about, our responsibilities towards each other, it's both unfair that so often the burden is on us as the victims to also create solutions. And we need to have a real conversation and a hard look about the ways white supremacy manifests within communities, such as through colorism, through privilege of education and class.
Yeah, I think that's a couple of things there, Erica, to do with the intersections, and the class issue is a really big one that we often don't talk about when it comes to the word privilege and things like that, but also this kind of notion that we have to encourage people and drum them up to be a support, which Dawn was saying. And actually, for me, allyship is about not having to prompt people. And often people will say, well, how do we know that we're making progress? And I'll say, well, we're making progress when, if I'm the minority in the room and something happens, I'm not looking around for who's going to say something, who's going to back me up, who's going to be the person.
Wouldn't that be an amazing time to, in our lifetimes that could ever happen? I mean, I'm sure it will, positivity and all that, but that's such a good example. Yeah.
Absolutely agreed.
Yeah. So in terms of, I think we've touched upon sort of what makes somebody an effective ally. Is there anything that you would like to see sort of people doing, perhaps in a more practical way? Like, what does it actually look like?
It doesn't, for me, sorry, I keep on jumping in every time.
Please,
Go
no.
for it, Dawn.
For me, it's not just saying you're buying the books and letting them gather dust in the corner. Not just sending a message saying, "Are you okay?" It's actually having, wanted to have a further conversation, face to face, not avoiding it. So yeah, as well. Allyship within my industry is not making me be the only one from the village, as it were, look up to a press event because it ticks a box. And that's happened to me, and I'm sure it's happened to you guys so many times. And I think I've lost my trail of thought now. I was getting too passionate. Yeah.
You want me to jump in, and then if it comes back to you, please dive right back in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it overarchingly, it looks like taking a risk and giving up a bit of your power.
Yes.
And that can look like, Joan Small's salary pledge, where she's giving up a bit of her salary, right? Every paycheck, the paycheck pledge, to groups supporting Black people. It looks like, I'm thinking of fashion examples. If you have any editorial control, so often we see these beautiful spreads of multicultural models, but the white model is in the front or she's in the center. And what about taking the risk of saying, hey, let's reorder this, right? It looks like when you have power to select a cast and crew on set, making sure that the cast and crew are representative of the community you're in.
And they can do the hair and makeup.
Exactly.
That's a good one as well. That'd be really
it's a big one.
Absolutely. And then it can also look like, there are microaggressions, right? Like, can you bring your own makeup because we don't have your color? I would love someone to say, well, then go buy it. Go buy it and figure it out. It's your job, right? Instead of leaving that to the model. And I don't want to limit it to just that example of like on set with models and say that all of the responsibility is there, because truly the power is like with the folks funding the sets, the editorial teams, et cetera, taking those practical positions to protect also the people of color on set who so often have to advocate for themselves. And it also looks like standing up to microaggressions and intervening when you see it. I'm sure you've all been in this position where someone says something out of pocket to you and you're looking around the table and no one's saying anything, and it's up to you to defend yourself, and you'll be accused of being the angry Black woman if you say anything. But then you go back to your desk and you've got 10 text messages from people who are in the room saying, oh my gosh, that was so wrong. Like, I'm so sorry, that
terrible
happened.
Fred shouldn't have said that. Are you okay? And you're thinking, well, I would have been all right if you'd have said something at the time to Fred.
There you go.
Yes.
Or even the flip side, where people actually, they don't realize what's just happened because they're not educated, and they haven't read the room, they haven't been listening, they haven't read the books, they don't understand that microaggression, because
they don't even recognize it.
They don't even recognize it. So the really important thing there is people need to be, as an ally, educating, consistently learning and continuing to learn, because it changes. This all changes all the time. We're moving and people need to move with it. Sorry, Erica, carry on.
No, that was great. And that's totally true. I think, again, to like what Dawn raised at the forefront is that, it's upon people with power to educate other people with power. It shouldn't be those who are marginalized and oppressed. Always doing the educating, always sounding the alarm, always standing up for ourselves. And we know that when interventions happen that protect the most marginalized, the data shows it actually protects everyone. As the saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. So when we're advocating for ourselves, I think especially as Black women who always face the strongest intersection of oppression, right, of our gender and our race, among other things, we are always at the forefront of civil rights, of policy change, of protection for health, for education. And who does that impact? It doesn't just impact us, it really helps everyone.
Yeah.
But it impacts us and benefits so many others. So, you know, the Me Too movement, who started that? Who got the credit? When was it actually put out there and recognized? And what had to happen? And what was the acceptable face of Me Too?
Yeah.
What did it look like? It didn't look like me,
No.
even though the woman that started it all did look like me.
Tarana Jean.
Yeah. Time and time again. And we help out time and time again. And we're like, thanks, bye. But when we want to be, you know, given the media coverage when one of us, you know, one of us disappears, or when one of us is wrongly accused of something, it's like tumbleweed.
And I think actually that kind of the next question was thinking about white privilege, and I think that kind of leads in to this notion of who is included and who is excluded, and whose stories are given time and space, and who isn't. And often when people hear the words white privilege, you know, a lot of kind of backs go up and it gets very awkward and people feel very uncomfortable. But actually that term is quite straightforward in, you know, if we explain what it really means. But I think sometimes people are misled by this word privilege as if it means, you know, you're very wealthy and you know, that's what it is. But obviously not. If you were going to maybe explain the notion of white privilege, how would you explain that to somebody?
Well, you know, I'd start by challenging the term itself, because to me, and you know, what I study and talk to about with clients is that white privilege is actually just white supremacy. It's the nature of the supremacy of whiteness in pretty much every culture, even in countries where there is not a white majority. Any country in the world that's been touched by imperialism and colonialism has a white supremacist structure.
Yeah.
And so it's not a privilege to be white. It is the supremacy of whiteness asserted over everyone else, and the frameworks and systems that allow that to be put in place. And you're right, privilege does not just refer to class and a socioeconomic status. It's so much more beyond that. So I love to talk about, when this comes up, the nature of whiteness and what makes someone white. And there was a movement actually alongside the civil rights movement, at least in the US in the 1960s, that really took hold in the 1970s, of whiteness studies in universities in the US and then in the UK and Europe. And I think actually some of the few whiteness programs still exist in Europe, but they've lessened in the US. And that is about, you know, what is actually lost when we assert whiteness, and assert whiteness as normalcy, as also the absence of culture and ethnicity, and as power. And, you know, what white people lose when they lose their ethnic identity, they lose that culture, is, you know, a sense of a real heritage beyond racist white supremacy that in the US looks like, you know, alliance with the KKK or white supremacist movements, or Nazism, right? They lose the ability to relate to that. And they also lose the socioeconomic diversity, or the power of their socioeconomic diversity, in that structures that privilege the ultra wealthy, tax structures especially, end up screwing over poor whites. But as you can see in US politics, for example, with the Republican Party, this call for reduced regulation, reduced taxes, hurts poor white people more than any other group. And yet poor white people overwhelmingly vote for those policies
And
Yes.
it's
because
the
they still
same
align with
here,
their
Erica, as you
conservatives.
will know.
Yeah. Mhm.
Same kind of structure here with, you know, we're seeing it now with the cuts that our Conservative government are doing is, you know, going to impact poorer white families. Yet people will still vote for that party. And I think
it's just
yeah.
so easy.
One of the things we talk about a lot, and it just reminded me when you were saying about the study of whiteness, Erica, is just about how the construct of race in the first place was created for this purpose, you know, for the divide and rule purposes. And I think there's a real lack of understanding as to the fact that race was a construct in the first place in order for one group to hold power over another.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, you'll hear pushback from white people who say, or people who say race is a construct. I don't see race. I'm colorblind. It's like, yes, it is a construct that is doing its job. It has been constructed.
Well. Yeah.
Exactly. To create this division, as you said, to justify, normalize, but also make invisible oppression so that it's built into our laws, it's built into our policies. And they don't have to say, you know, that we want to exclude Black people, but effectively the policies do that.
Yes.
And that is the nature of the construct of race.
Yeah.
And, you know, this goes to one other thing I wanted to raise, which is about identities and the types of identities there are. And it always troubles me. I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit with the D&I questions, but just to give a teaser, I always get very wary when companies tell me they have an expansive understanding of diversity, because they'll show me, then that means that they probably include diversity of thought and current socioeconomic status or socioeconomic background as a marker of diversity, which effectively results in the hiring and promotion and retention and application and amplification of white people.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have to think about are primary and secondary characteristics of diversity. And it's basically, what can we change about how we are perceived and what can we not change about how we are perceived? And I'm so excited for the film Passing that's coming out and revisiting the book by Nella Larson, because I think it digs into that a lot. And it's not that, you know, effectively, we can't change our race, at least as we are perceived by society.
Yeah.
We cannot change our gender as we are perceived by society. So yes, you can have gender information surgery and you should do that if that makes you feel affirmed, right? And yet we see violence against Black trans women, especially as a response to that, and that you do not look the way I think a woman should look, or you do look like the way I think a man should look, and you're not acting in that way, and therefore I have the right to hurt you. And so we have to think about our characteristics, not just as we see ourselves, but how we are perceived in the world, and therefore how the world treats us. And the world does not see poverty 2 generations back when they look at you. They do not see that, even if that impacts your experience. And so I'm always a little troubled when groups say, well, we take that into account when we count diversity. It's like, let's think about the types of identities and diversity that actually impact our experience in the world, how we are perceived and how we are treated due to that perception.
Yeah, it's really
yeah,
good.
it's really interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, so that actually links us again quite nicely to our next question. So kind of looking at the term white exceptionalism, so looking at how problematic it is when, you know, if you're a white person and you might have a mixed race child or a Black child or a Black partner or a person of color who is a friend, and people sort of use that as an excuse of kind of, oh, well, I can't be racist because, you know,
my mate's Black.
Yeah, we've all heard that sort of narrative. And I think, yeah, we've definitely heard it, as we're mixed race, so half our family are white. So again, you know, we've sort of heard that. Can we talk a little bit around that and why that's problematic? Because I think again, it's something that I hear often, but actually what is it about that term that is problematic and doesn't erase you from, you know, causing trauma or hurt?
I would like to think that I take everyone at face value. Personally, I'm very blessed to have a family that is, we're very mixed as a family, and I'm also very lucky in the sense that I also have been able to meet some amazing people of different races, and that has allowed me to be more, what's the word I'm looking for? More, it's not accepting, because it's not like I need to accept anyone, but it means I'm more worldly, shall we say, for want of a better word. I think that, if that said, doesn't mean that there hasn't been in the past, and I will put my hands up and say that there have been certain people that I might think less kindly to, because usually because of how they have treated my race, I will admit. So what I'm trying to say is, if I can think that way, then why, just because my partner is, say, white, or someone in my family is of mixed race, can they not also be racist or ignorant, for want of a better word? So I'm speaking as myself and from my own experience. And in a nutshell, it doesn't mean that you can't be racist. It absolutely doesn't. I've been in situations with family members, and they can use that word, or they can call someone of a different race one of those words which is not acceptable, and that's family.
Yeah.
To say that you can't be racist, transphobic, homophobic, whatever, it's unrealistic. It isn't. Yeah, unrealistic.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I agree with you in that we all either have or are fighting some internalized white supremacy. And I imagine that's more real to some folks who are in mixed race families or interracial relationships. And, it looks like different things, but we all know what it is. And it's this primacy of whiteness in our own sense of selves, or how we perceive others. I'll never forget when I was at Oxford, I was often confused with the Nigerian American girl in my class, whose both parents were Nigerian. We look completely different. I love her. She's one of my dear friends, and I consider her a sister in that sense, but that would not be my professor's perception. And yet we were constantly confused for one another.
Yeah.
And, I am Black and Japanese. My father is Black. My mother is Japanese. And in class, people would say, when I'd say, as a Black woman, there would be people in class who would speak up to tell me who I am. And they'd say, but you're not that Black. Or you're not Black, you're Métis. Or you're mixed race. It's a different category, right? You're colored. If you were from South Africa, you'd be colored.
That grinds my gears. Anytime I hear that,
And it just made me sick, right? Because it's like, what does that mean to you then? Does that mean, and we know what that means. And on the flip side, and going back to this idea, going back to the conversation about privilege, I, as a mixed race woman, as someone who's light skinned, have to own my relative privilege that white people bestow to me because they think I'm not as Black. Because they think I'm closer to them in some way. And we see too how, the fashion industry, the entertainment industry, so many industries really try to do a bit of skirting when they say, oh, sure, we've hired a Black woman, and you see the Black woman and she's mixed. Right. And we see this whitewashing and this colorism in film so much more today, even than we did before, which is so troubling.
It's weird that we're going back in time in some ways, you know. Yeah, I noticed that too.
Absolutely. And so I think of this article that I recommend everyone read by Anna Holmes, who is mixed race. She's the founder of the feminist website Jezebel, and a writer. And she wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times back in 2018 called Black with Some White Privilege. And I thought it was so good because it was one of the few times I felt like we as mixed race people could own our privilege and own accountability, and talk about, like, real talk, like, yes, there are many more Black luminaries and Black figures in current and contemporary politics and media and entertainment. However, let's be real, most of those people are mixed. So what is that saying about what we're actually like doing with this representation work? And actually, it was interesting that so many mixed race people were mad at her for writing this article, because she felt like that she was negating their experiences with racism. But you know, I think it's like, okay, well, if it's making you feel some type of way, maybe you need to examine that.
Yeah. Maybe you need to interrogate that.
Yeah.
So we've got to challenge it.
But you don't think that sometimes we as Black people, quite often we don't help ourselves in this area. We don't help ourselves by admitting that this can still be the case, that we can still have these insecurities or these perceptions ourselves, or not calling people out within our family or friendship groups or whatever, when they do say, oh, I can't be racist because of this, this, and this, when you know that they have said something that was racist, or, you know, I just think sometimes we don't help ourselves. We have to, you know, call people out sometimes.
Yeah. I think it's really tricky when it depends on the situation and like the power dynamic that's going on as well.
With family, I guess. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And I think absolutely, Dawn, I don't know, I feel more empowered now to say things, whereas, you know, a couple of years ago when we just weren't talking in this way in the mainstream. I do feel more empowered now, but I don't know about you, but still get met with such fragility when you do challenge things.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's hard. It really is. I mean, as I was just saying, you know, years ago, it feels like we were in a far better place in this area. And with George Floyd and so many other things, yes, we're talking more freely, but equally, I feel we've been set back. And I'm not sure how or why that is happening. I don't understand it.
I think it's because we just haven't been having these conversations, that it's like something blew open, and we're talking in ways that we haven't been talking. Like in the UK particularly, people just were very and I don't know if you experienced this, Erica, when you were here, this like polite veneer of like, oh, aren't we multicultural and everybody gets on, and isn't this really good, and everyone's
I love going to the carnival, you know.
Absolutely.
Restaurants, and isn't it lovely, and I like a bit of music, you know, and it's that kind of thing.
You know that Buju Banton,
Anyway. Oh, I heard so often, well, you know, we abolished slavery first. So why is it so hard for you all in America? America's a really racist place, isn't it? Like, well, I'm at Oxford. and Black students are like being stopped by security for going onto their own college grounds.
Yes. Yeah. I had that when I was at Farnham. I was in a uni in Surrey, and we used to get escorted by police. There was a group of us. We got escorted by our own police car every night when we went to the bar. Every night. It's fun. Like, they'll take us out. You know, it's just, Wow. I reckon it will probably still happen today.
Yeah. Yeah.
It does.
And I
Yeah.
think, to your question, like the forces who are dedicated to maintaining the status quo of white supremacy are doubling down. And so we are making progress in terms of like this being a normalized conversation, this
Yeah.
being something that companies, organizations, individuals feel accountable to. But the powers that be are pushing back on that as hard as possible. And
Yeah.
it's not by accident, it's a decades long, ever since the civil rights movement and really before, basically, as soon as at least slavery in the US was abolished, white powers have been working to reassert slavery in different ways ever since. And they're constantly innovating.
Mhm.
And we, I think, need to, as people generally, not just as Black people, as people of color, but people who care about freedom and peace and liberation, we need to recognize that we also need to innovate the ways that we do that. And we need to do so in solidarity.
Mm.
And I saw a really great quote recently. I can't remember who said it, but it was that, organizers and activists, we need to recognize that what works is not bringing power over to our side. It's about making the powers recognize they will lose if they do not acknowledge us. And so this is accountability. Like, what are the consequences to companies who made all these pledges in the wake of George Floyd's murder and have not followed through?
Such a good point. And I personally think I would like to see that list. I've actually tried to put that together, and my team and I have tried to do that. Not to get angry at them, but I mean just for my own information, because we saw the black squares.
Yeah. We all saw them.
Just as we see the rainbow flags, and it's just, we're not a marketing ploy. This is us. This is our lives.
Right.
I'm not blessed with children as yet, but I personally, I'm not going to have my nephews, nieces, godchildren go through the crap I had to go through.
Yeah.
No way.
No.
And by doing things that we do with Seat at the Table, where thankfully brands are listening to us and saying, what can we do?
Yeah.
That is a little step, but there's so much more to do.
Yeah.
And that's just, there are so many companies out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That
for
give our
you,
money to-
Dawn, because obviously this is what, you're working with lots of different brands and companies, as are you, Erica. What are some of the things that you have perhaps seen happen that are problematic? We obviously saw the black squares, we saw the wave of pledges, and suddenly the representation had improved, on the surface and things like this. What are some of the things that you've seen that are problematic?
I personally have seen, listen, everyone can be educated and everyone can have experience and whatever, but in the wake of the black squares, there were lots of diversity and inclusion people hired. And I kid you not, on at least 50 of those, the person was not of color. The person was not gay or trans or in any way a minority.
Yeah.
That made no sense to me.
No.
And the fact that people hired them and were tone deaf and hired them, that just,
Yeah.
I was literally at some of them, I was like,
Yeah.
There's a great resource founded by a Black woman, her name's Sherelle Dorsey, and it's called The Plug Insights, and it looks at Silicon Valley, it looks at large brands and companies, and they actually did make that spreadsheet, Dawn, at least for the tech sector and for related industries, on who made pledges.
I'm learning a lot from you today. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's what I'm here for.
Anyway, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please do. And so she has a whole spreadsheet, And what it shows is that like 90% of these companies haven't followed through. And
Yeah.
from my own experience at tech companies, when I saw their responses to to making a statement and creating a pledge, I noticed, because I worked on their teams and worked in those areas, oh, this is not new funding that they're allocating. They're just reallocating funding they haven't spent yet. Or this is not a new program. This is a program that they just did not talk about before, and now they are.
Yes.
And so be wary of that as well. You know, what I'm seeing specifically in the fashion industry that is a little troubling to me is, you know, once again, the lack of follow through on the pledges. A lot of talk and no action, and talks relying on people of color to give and employees to provide their emotional labor, to provide their experiences and putting themselves out there to be vulnerable without any protections in place. So people are sharing stories and then they're being retaliated against, right? And I'm sure that's in every industry, but particularly in the fashion industry, where companies are so informal, they don't really have HR, right? They say they can't afford to have HR, they can't afford to have like a culture officer, things like that. And so you're really putting vulnerable, marginalized people up for further marginalization when you force them to share their stories and experience without these protections in place. And then finally, you know, sadly, I think as people of color, we are still being offered scraps in fashion, and we're accepting it. You know, it's like, why
help us? And you can tell people sorry to interrupt, Erica, but
no,
please. You can tell them time and time again, no, what you do by accepting that is going to set us all back years. Bide your time, know your worth, so everyone else knows our worth. But there's, unfortunately, whether it's through struggle, you know, and desperation, they take it, quite often get shafted, for want of a better word, and then there's no chance for anyone else to come through again. Whereas if they bided their time, got together, got the support from, you know, others, there's more power there.
There is. And
this also goes back to, you know, when you see a young Black boy in a campaign wearing a t-shirt with a monkey on it, you know that store knew what it was doing. You know someone saw that on the mood board, but yet it still came through. But you're still going to go and shop there. You're going to give the power that you have away. Whereas if you simply said, nah, group chat and family chat, do not go here for this reason, and people stuck to that and kept on doing that, because unfortunately, these brands only care about the dollar, pound, whatever. That's all they listen to. But we have to deal with everything else.
And I think both of you, when you're talking about the kind of pledges and what people said they were going to do, and it really shows up now, because we're, you know, a year, 2 years down the line, and you're still seeing the same mistakes show up. And no longer can people say, oh, well, we didn't realize, or, you know, we were just learning, we're still in the early stages. And you can really see who's putting the work in. And we do anti-racism training with organizations, and we get the same things as you've mentioned. You know, you get the Black and brown and people of color who work at the organizations, the pressures on them to get to do the work for no extra money. They have to organize everything behind the scenes. You know, people are being asked to go and speak and they're not being paid. The campaigns look good, but then when you get to behind the scenes, it's the same people, and that's why the mistakes are happening as well, because no one's actually there to call any of this out.
Yeah.
In terms of diversity and inclusion, do you think that a lot of organizations are using it as a kind of tokenistic gesture? And how do we change that? How do we create lasting change?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion as a field is a scapegoat for applying labor and civil rights law.
Wow.
That's it.
Yeah.
And this is coming as someone who is a DEI, you know.
Mic drop and a half. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Because what I seek to do is get organizations and companies to follow labor law and civil rights law. But what I have to call it is DEI, so it will be palatable to them.
Yeah.
And that is the industry as a whole. And you have folks who do not see that connection, and they should not be in this work if they don't. But it works for the status quo of white power to not create standards in this area, right? To not create, but also conversely, it also works for them to pit all of us against each other, to say, you're not a legit, right? Your experience isn't valid here. Mine is, when we're criticizing other people of color, when it's like, compared to other industries, like the D&I, there was a lot of criticism, for example, that the DEI industry is slated to make like 8 billion in the next year, right? I mean, that's like the quarterly take home from a Facebook. So like, why are we fighting again over scraps when industry as a whole is like crossing the trillion mark every quarter? Right. So, and that is where the issue is. So when I approach that work, I'm thinking about civil rights law, I'm thinking about labor law, and I'm thinking about how can we hold companies accountable to those laws without having the strength of that law on our side, right? Because these are the least enforced laws, and they have the weakest penalties. And also we have to get beyond representation in DEI, where this is where the tokenization occurs. Oh, we have a Black VP.
Yeah.
We have a Black.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And often it's like, okay, as a company who is not good on these things, what kind of Black person, let's be real here. What kind of Black person are you going to choose for this position? You're going to choose someone whose politics, whose cultural ideals already align with yours, and they just happen to be
who would
Black.
feel comfortable in this environment? What kind of person?
And so then that person becomes the gatekeeper to other people of color. And then it also creates this false perception that this is acceptable for all people of color. So it's still an unfair position to be in, to be the token, because then you have to represent the entire race and entire races, right?
I have to say that for me, throughout my career, I have been actually quite surprisingly, in some respects, because I'm very dark skinned, natural hair. I'm not backwards and coming forwards, as I'm sure you can probably tell. But I do believe I've been the acceptable person within quite a few of the companies that I've worked at. And it was only when, I never reshaped myself to be something that I wasn't. But at the same time, for whatever reason, they felt I was okay to let out. So I'm saying it's so negative, but I think you know what I mean. But it began to get a bit uncomfortable when I wanted to say more. Because I needed to say more. And that's when I basically decided to do my own thing. And that is that was 10 years ago, and I'm still seeing the same faces. There's not that many more that are coming through. There are some, and I'm praying that we're going to get more, but there's such a long way to go. Such a long way to go.
Yeah, it really is.
And when you do have that responsibility of being the only one in the village, shall we say, it is hard work, and it can be stressful, and It's unfair.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It is,
absolutely.
I think we're going to have to stop there because we have run out of time.
Oh,
But
we could have carried on.
Could have carried on for
It was so great. You guys are amazing.
This
Really.
was wonderful.
no, this
you
panel,
guys are brilliant.
Yeah, was really inspirational, and thank you so much for everything you both shared, because I know a lot of people will get so much out of that.
Absolutely.
And I think, yeah, we need to continue these conversations. We need to continue learning and educating, and yeah, putting allyship into action as well.
Absolutely.
Where we can. So yeah, thank you again.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. And if you have any questions or want to put anything into the chat, then you are more than welcome to. So a really big thank you to Erica Banks and Dawn Mason for the How to Be an Ally panel. Take care. Bye-bye.
Everyone. Bye.